Hello everyone, today we talk about the origins of the Trace Italienne. So we will start essentially from the classical low medieval castle and see what happened roughly from the 15th century, because the Trace Italienne is normally attached, let's say, to the Besson force that began to be fully developed in their characteristics in the roughly from the 30s of the 16th century, but the actual transformations and theorizations and experiments actually took place already from the 15th century. And we have to motivate this, we have to explain essentially why this happened. So we must focus on one factor, that is essentially what the evolution of fortifications had been in the last century of the Middle Ages, which was actually relatively poor. I mean, we can't say, I mean, that if you take an 11th century Moat and Bailey castle, that was pretty much the average that existed out there at the time, and you take say a 13th, 14th century castle with all obviously in stone and with different layers of walls and all and ditches and very complex architecture relatively to the machicolation-based defense, because this is actually what it was all about, with curtains, merlons, and brassers, and all. You understand that there is a pretty substantial difference, and this had happened. I mean, it's a micro. Let's say in a smaller scale, what basically happened later, because of the cause of this. Which is also fairly complicated to explain, because it's pretty easy to say, especially in the case of the Trace Italienne, that the change occurred because of artillery, of real artillery, meaning firearms, cast iron balls that had this sheer destructive potential that no other artillery had before. Not even the early firearms. You know, the artillery is something that starts becoming a must in the arsenal of the up-to-dated European prince in roughly the 20s of the 15th century. Before, artillery was used in a different way, and actually the whole development of artillery and Renaissance fortifications was something very slow. Parker's idea of revolution, of the military revolution, is something that, you know, we're all thankful to Parker for what he wrote, but it's a kind of an old perception of historiography, and personally, I'd say in general, a poor linguistical choice. There was nothing like a revolution. Firearms didn't bring to military revolutions. It took just think about you know, pike and shot army, pike and shot tactics. I mean, it took actually essentially 200 years to pass from the full Renaissance pike block to the linear tactics of the 18th century. It wasn't a revolution at all. However, there are definitely, I mean, it's not a revolution not because of the speed. It's a revolution because revolution is a wrong term, even conceptually speaking, to define what really happened. In spite of, you know, what, even if it had taken in place in half of the time, it still would have been a revolution. So in the case of firearms, this transformation was all the more evident because of the sheer physical force that firearms had. I mean, if you take the actual jowl, not just in artillery but also in arquebuses or any other firearm from the 16th century, you realize that any other weapon that had existed before had a missile weapon had, like, now I don't remember, I could look if you have the patience, but it's like something like 20 more more joules than than it actually was a that an arquebus bullet could have had compared to a crossbow bolt. That's the reason why Europeans and progressively also other peoples that developed pike and shot tactics. Actually, pike and shot tactics is not something. It's not a European prerogative. It seems that in China it had begun to be developed even earlier in times, and there were certain copies all over the world, eventually also of European tactics. But the let's say the sheer energy that these projectiles contained made armor useless practically in at least on a mass scale. Then eventually there was extensive use of armor in some measure, especially during still up to the 18th century on battlefields. Then the whole thing kind of changed because they realized that muskets could simply pierce through that, and in sheer economical terms, it was more profitable to win a war with all the costs that implied by spending your money in, I don't know, producing more muskets and not producing armor. Also in here it was something very slow in the process, but overall we can see that objectively the face of battle did change throughout all those centuries, and there is this evident let's say gushing impetus factor that brought to that change. In the case of the Long Middle Ages, it's not that evident, because it is true that trebuchet and other more sophisticated siege weaponry compared to the early medieval times had kicked in. But at that point it's even difficult to explain the cause and effect relation, because the development of stone castles and the developing of siege machinery that could be effective against it had been practically they went in parallel. And telling the truth, as it happened, by the way, also in this is something in parallel you have also on a tactical level, in the sense that if you take crossbow bolts, those were the use of crossbow extended in parallel with the battering of the armor. Now people tend to say, and I'm perhaps among that group, that it was more the projectile that basically triggered the defensive needs, which sounds logical, really, because up to the time to which coat of mail was basically capable of stopping almost everything that was on the battlefield. Why spending more for getting heavier and to spend more money essentially to create plate armor, the coat of plates? So that kind of makes sense, but we still have to think that there were other factors. There weren't just projectiles. There were also very important political and hence military and social factors that triggered that. Take even the development of infantry. Of commoners' armies. That is something that definitely had its place in the development of the coat of plates. Crossbow, in this sense, were a commoner's weapon in many ways, and if Europe, for instance, hadn't had the political and social organization that it had at the time, that effectively made commoners arming themselves against the nobles, probably even armor, doesn't matter whether a crossbow had been introduced or not, would have not developed in the same fashion, or at least it would have developed in relatively different times and ways. So that yeah, I think this is a right premise. Excuse me, drink a little. And in the case of castles, let's say that up to the perfectionment of of firearms during the 15th century, the castle had won. I mean, the castle formula had been effective, highly effective. That's the reason why Europe was covered in castles, right? Which were something very expensive. I mean, castles are something also in here that, just like in the modern age, actually triggered the necessity of having a more centralized government that could levy taxes to actually finance such the building of such large fortifications, so that as the modern state for someone is born thanks to artillery, which is also an approximation but kind of makes sense in part, people say that national monarchies in the low Middle Ages were developed also because of the introduction of trebuchet and the evidence that the old forms of fortification that had existed up to that point were outdated, because they could be easily overcome. And that is important when you have a territorial domination for which, from one point you can rely on a cheaper, let's say, a cheaper system basically to stop effectively invasions, for instance, and then that ends, and therefore invaders have kind of a greater strategic pose a greater strategic threat, can penetrate more easily into your territory, and so on. So all this was a very very slow and complex and intricate development. I mean, it wasn't something that evidently changed from a day to another. However, what really shook, what really woke up in this sense, the medieval siege warfare was definitely the evolution of artillery that grew increasingly more efficient. So, as we said, the machicolation-based defense with the high towers, the elegant curtains, turned out to be too fragile, because the hammering of cast iron cannonballs began to be too hard to stop. So there is all an evolution. For instance, the first artillery projectiles were in stone. That had certain characteristics, were more fragile. Iron has evidently a higher specific weight, so it can more effectively smash through a fortification. So, and even the merlons, the embrasures, and and other, let's say, architectural characteristics that were out there for the sake of defense turned out to become useless in practice, because the siege warfare wasn't anymore about ladders, cats, or siege towers. It was it left, let's say, to the ward to the cannon. That was something also frightening on its own. This doesn't mean, however, that the previous siege warfare was something so rudimentary as we think. Actually, medieval siege warfare was pretty sophisticated even before the arrival of the development of firearms. It's really and fortifications were the cardinal to this. I mean, the fortification in this sense is not set in a sort of empty space for which you just want to test how long or how hard you want to hit a fortification in order to be broken by siege machinery. There are all strategic elements that bring essentially to the dynamics that for which fortifications were built, where they were built, how long they were I mean, there was a huge variety of castles. And there weren't, the European castles hadn't evolved all in the same fashion. There was obviously always the same elementary costs benefits ratio that was continuously bore in mind, and the overall even siege machinery could be used could be used here and there. I mean, sometimes in the 14th century you have these monster trebuchet like the one built by Edward III. That's, I don't know where this. Probably at the time it was something monstrous. We don't have, unfortunately, any any material evidence of how it was practically built, but we can imagine at that time it was something incredible, and many people already back then would have thought that that with a weapon like that, castles could be turned into debris in a short while. But that also had to consider how much that siege weapon had costed, and how was it possible basically to deploy it, how adaptable to the various tactical and even strategical scenarios, because not all the regions of Europe are the same. Not all the ground, the terrain allows you to do certain things, nor to find the material to build that. So firearms, in this sense, put in motion something actually much larger that, as we were saying before, by many is conceived even as, take Parker, the idea of the military revolution. That is something that goes much beyond the simple, say, the bare military element, and translates itself into politics, into economy, into society. Because in order to produce firearms, the European powers had to draw an incredible, an unprecedented amount of resources that the political structures back then hadn't been able, if not maybe just to dream of, and therefore to build up with extreme difficulty. For reasons that now, I mean, I know I'm digressing, but that's really how it is. I mean, to build the centralized state, or at least to start building it, and therefore having this coexistence of a partial, let's say, early permanent armies, or however, all a certain logistical organization with settled depots and fortifications and other infrastructures that would serve the army, and the usual, say, feudal or better mercenary way of recruiting that actually remained the basic form of recruitment overall, quantitatively, up to practically the 18th century, also depending on which state you're thinking at, because not all the European states developed in the same fashion. But the beginnings also in here were relatively slow. They weren't slow, let's say, there were these developments entailed a huge effort already at the beginning, but the effects were still relatively small. So there is a passage from Machiavelli's Art of War that I would like to translate. Machiavelli had is most famous for the Prince and other works, the Art of War being surely one of them, but just for saying that Machiavelli wrote an awful lot of of material Um, and those are all extremely fascinating things to read. If you have the chance, most of that it's open access, I think, on the internet. And please read it, because it's very, especially if you know something about Italian, please try to read it in the original language, because it's even way more meaningful. So the art of war here, in this passage, it's a dialogue that I'm not getting into. I'm just quoting Fabrizio, that is the guy who is discussing here. I don't remember here the exact quote. It's the art of war. I can give you the quote. Oh no, I have only the pages where whatever. I can't find excuse me a little. Oh, okay. Here it is. This is a passage that essentially is commenting on the French invasion of Italy that occurred in 1494. So it's the beginning of the Italian wars. And this expedition had been famous because essentially the French had brought into Italy a huge army that had, especially for the time, a huge artillery park. The French, actually the Italians were ahead in military technology compared to the French, but this is the important part. So never think that technology is the answer to things, because you can have technology, but you still have to have a base and a structure that is able to sustain that technology production, and especially a doctrine of use. And therefore France, that at this time was the most advanced counter in Europe, aside perhaps from the Ottomans, definitely. It was also had reached a sort of, relatively to the French, today's French borders, a sort of unity for which it was the most powerful, the largest power in Europe, the almost hegemonic. Probably this is too strong as a word. Louis the 14th, France was the hegemonic power of Europe. Here, France was seemingly something pretty close to that, and definitely a huge power for those times standards, especially in Europe. And here it comments. It says, "I will tell you again that the methods and organizations of war in all the world, with respect to those of the ancients, are extinct. But in Italy, they are entirely lost, and if there is something more powerful, it results from the examples of the ultramontanes, that is, the French. You may have heard, and these others can remember, how weakly things were built before King Charles of France crossed into Italy in the year 1494. The battlements were made a half-arm length thin, wide. The places for the crossbowmen and bombardiers, that is the gunners, were made with a small aperture outside and a large one inside, and with many other defects which I will only omit, not to be tedious. For the defences are easily taken away from slender battlements. The places for bombardiers built that way are easily opened, that is, demolished. Now from the French we have learned to make the battlements wide and large, and also to make the places of the bombardiers wide on the side, and narrow it at the center of the wall, and then again widen it up to the outside edge. And this results in the artillery being able to demolish its defenses only with difficulty. The French, moreover, have many other arrangements such as these, which, because they have not been seen thus, have not been given consideration. Among which is this method of the shutters made in the form of a grid, which is by far a better method than yours. For if you have to repair the shutters of a gate such as yours, lowering it if you are locked inside and hence are unable to endure the enemy, so that they can attack it safely either in the dark or with a fire. But if it is made in the shape of a grid, you can, once it's lowered by those weaves and intervals, to be able to defend it with lances, crossbows, and every other kind of arms. Anyhow, I wasn't even meant to read it all because it wasn't this last phrase in particular wasn't that necessary. But into this page, Machiavelli, telling the truth, is not truly very just with Italian military architecture, because that's where it actually started, where everything was started, practically. So here Machiavelli is not, I mean, it's a beautiful read, but he's not really to be taken as, seriously many times. Machiavelli could distort even the most blatant evidence just to make his theories fit into it, and he wasn't this extremely acute historian or observer of the reality he was actually living in. But he still says incredibly interesting things, especially on the political side. In terms of the military here, basically he is saying, if you have followed, that the whole thing started with the French invasion. I mean, here is talking essentially about the fact that the military, let's say the Italian fortifications were essentially being transformed as a consequence of the French invasion. This is actually false. The French invasion happened quite late in time. The Italians were already far ahead. Were already pioneering the major transformations in fortifications at this point, by creating something very different from in substance to what had been the traditional castle construction. What it is important, however, well, first of all, let's discuss about these typologies of fortifications. First of all, these fortifications were characterized by the so-called oblique defense, as a term is usually borrowed from the French. The concept of this fortification, maybe we'll start to see it later. I'm not sure. Maybe we'll list that later. Let's first of all finish this concept here. The idea is that even if the oblique defense fully was developed fully into the during the 16th century, so later, it's already from the 15th that the architects had, however, basically began to transform fortifications in the essentials. One characteristic of 15th century military architecture is that the engineers, the architects, were trying to essentially respect, as much as they could, the old traditional castle models of castle construction. And it is telling the truth exactly from this point of view that we can trigger more easily when on a timeline when the change actually occurred, because it's not that the Italians began to form the Trasse Italienne from scratch. The Italians were still pretty traditionalists at this time, not really because of their own traditions, but because they were essentially studying the classics. the whole Western Europe at that time was in love with humanism, with the models that could be offered by the Romans and the Greeks. And these included basically every aspect of those civilizations, including fortifications. Now, it's pretty obvious that Greek and Roman fortifications were something laughable compared to what even the Europeans at this point had been able, even without firearms, to build up. The ancient world siege warfare was something very developed and sophisticated as well, but we don't have to think it as anything that could match at that point 15th century siege art of warfare. One of the consequences, however, as we were saying, is that the Italians tried to preserve initially those characteristics, those architectonic characteristics of the older castle tradition. That is the towers, the curtains, and generally speaking, this broader outlook of the old castle as it was. Even the planimetry wasn't immediately the geometric, the one of the bastion forts with all the various angles and all. I mean, it's something that took time, and at that time these first experiments were still the most advanced that you could find in Europe. But it's exactly from these elements we can spot the transformation, because the towers began increasingly to enlarge and to lower. The curtains began to become way stronger. They started to be reinforced by terraplanes. Let's say the outline, the plans began to be always more modulated with certain salients and recesses and narrowing. I don't know how to say that. That is to essentially create that concept of the of trying to take out any blind spot around the walls, so that you could basically hit every besieger that was going there to attack. But we will see it later. So you can understand that albeit the outlook, the aesthetics, still looked at the old castle tradition, the essentials, the sheer substance began to change. You start see appearing corners, curves, the semicircles, so that the artillery placed on the spals or on the bastions could hit every external side of the fortress. Without any doubt, there were also many other influences at that time. The Renaissance was pretty much obsessed by the idea of perfection, of geometrical perfection from the ancient Hellenic world. So the idea that the perfect society had to come out with certain the ideal city, especially in Italy, the idea of the city-state was very strong. Also in here, on the far of the ancient Greek and Roman tradition, albeit Italian signories were something relatively different, yet still based in the cities. So the city had to be practically the base of every form of government, also as a social model, as a etc. So that what you find among the urbanists of the 15th century in terms of these philosophical architectonic ideals of geometrical harmony, etc., heavily influenced also the planimetry of new the plant of new fortresses, and with especially their central plant dispositions and their starred and flower or polygonal or radiant in general form, with all the hermetic meanings that were attributed to these forms that definitely had an evidently effective character in terms of efficacy in military terms. We will see it now, but it also concealed certain new conceptions of the world, exoterism, and all these magical values, we can say, that were attributed to the perfect geometrical forms, to the geometric perfection, to the and to the all the meanings that were attached to them, and even in looking at the universe, looking at etc. So the oblique defense is something that we were talking about the French invasion of 1494, but if you take the construction of the new castle of Naples, built by Alphonse of Aragon between 1442 and 1450, you see that oblique defense was conceived already in there. The castle of Naples, there were at that time I think already 3 castles in Naples, and the new castle had been built already, was something older, but what was usual in this sense, or at this time, was not to build a fortress from scratch, but essentially reinforcing it architectonically speaking, engineering speaking, with a fortification over the pre-existing castle. So that was evidently more convenient to do, because initially, as we were saying, these new kinds of fortifications costed a freaking lot. So up to a moment into which artillery was not excessively developed, it could be, you could essentially put a sort of patch over your old fortresses and try to go on with that. But it was really the further developments that especially had taken place from the last quarter of the 15th century, thanks to Francesco di Giorgio Martini and his school, to launch in this field a really innovating concept more than else. Actually, Francesco di Giorgio Martini was and the Martinians from his school, let's say, was is considered a bit the father of the class Italienne, especially from these figures were definitely very polyedric, and they're typical of Italian Renaissance. These people were architects and theorists of architecture, painter, engineer, sculptor, and medalist. I mean, these people were basically skilled a bit in everything. It's indeed true that at that time there was a bit less to know than what we do today. But it's still, more than this, it's still very meaningful to see that the Renaissance was producing people who had, first of all, an omnicomprehensive knowledge. That was the goal of humanism and let's say the Renaissance culture for a very long time. Think about later, I don't know, Indigo Jones, or these people who had something that we really lack a lot as moderns, that is a comprehensive knowledge of the world. Of the world. through which obviously they were researching for arcane and meanings and hidden secrets and stuff like that. I mean, science at this point, just like together with medicine, it was all one thing with alchemy. There was no difference between astronomy and astrology. So think about, I don't know, Paracelsus, all the humors, all the thing. It was, obviously these are things that for our scientific knowledge today are laughable, but we should never forget that actually our scientific revolution came from the so-called scientific revolution, right, from Galileo, Newton, and etc., came from that world. And it came from the theorizations of these people partly, that partly were just inventing that or following ancient knowledge that was equally wrong and obsolete, but at the same time trying to figure out better what was, even to make us and making a synopsis of the of knowledge. Let's say, let's just think about Francis Bacon and how his tables, how the laws of nature could be somehow found even in these schemes and in these systematizations. I mean, it was something that was trying to put order into a world that otherwise hadn't any, because medieval science and technology were had been something eminently practical. I mean, one and doesn't mean that it was in this sense inferior. Many people believe that, I don't know, the Renaissance was started because of because you read a book and then you have that knowledge, and therefore you can transform things. Actually, it's the other way around. I mean, the Renaissance is born when people are already enough skilled to be able to, first of all, to have time and because even of their wealth and all, to read a book, not the other way around. In fact, most of Renaissance culture is chiefly philological. It's not really scientific. It's not that the Middle Ages had this great deal to know from the ancient world in practical terms. A lot of people actually believe this, that, I don't know, before the Renaissance, I mean, the Renaissance was triggered because the word Byzantine refugees that brought together with them the classical manuscripts. This isn't like that. The West was already massively more advanced than the world that was depicted in the classical manuscripts from any point of view. I mean, at this point, 15th century Europe was more advanced than any other time Europe had ever been. And humanism and the Renaissance are born actually for the needs of the Western Europeans, simply to know more, to add, to integrate essentially new information to the one that massively already knew. And that's the moment why they got interested. And this happened actually also back in the day. Trebuchets were built in northern Italy in the 12th century, not because they had read some book coming from the east, but because they had already been made to build. They had built them by themselves, and at that point, we know that philologically speaking, this is an evidence that it's only at that point that Italians got interested in, but maybe, the ancient already wrote something about it. Let's go read what they had written about. And that's where that knowledge poured in and was integrated, even profitably, but we see that the technology actually was already there before. So we shouldn't indulge into these technologistic and mechanicistic ideas that are typical of the modern mentality, that is, that you need technology to make progress. It's progress that asks for technology. It's not the other way around. This is like the ABC of history of technology. In order to acquire technology, you already have to know how to use it in practice. and because you must have a need for using it, that there are technologies that are suspended in the air for even 1 century, and not finding a real application because they're so ahead of their times that they can't be properly adopted in practice because of the social structure of the economical index and all. Excuse me, drinking a little again. So even the Renaissance here was essentially development already on an extremely fertile ground that had borne its fruits, and most of actually what you can find in the highest theorization, something in fact highly abstract. What you understand that is that the Middle Ages had already been the civilization of the machines. Just go read, I don't know, manuscripts from the 12th, the 13th century. Look at what machines were theorized at that time, and we know that didn't happen because of ancient. There is no evidence of this ancient influx that, if anything, was retaken later. And you understand that for practical needs, men do not wait for a book to tell them what to do; they just do that. And eventually they will write a book, and the world want to read similar ones to the one they'd have, because also writing a book in this sense was considered at that time a matter of canon, so that you could practice a lot, even with medicine. The highest doctors at this time were largely all humanists, and they had and medicine at that time was a highly theoretical thing. Doctors didn't touch their patients. It was the barbers and the so-called I don't know how to, the cerussicus in Latin, that were the guys who actually cut arms and legs, made complex operations and all, because really Renaissance culture is elitist. It developed in especially in courtly environments where they were relatively detached from the much more developed and dynamic advancements in technology that were occurring chiefly in the middle classes. In fact, if you take all these great Italian masters of military engineering, of architecture, painters, and all, think about Leonardo da Vinci, or these were people who had actually a humble extraction, and that they began to serve the courts, the lords, because of their practical knowledge. That was what really, in fact, made the difference in these fashions. The same year of the French invasion of Italy, 1494, think about the fortifications began by Antonio da Sangallo of the Castel Sant'Angelo in Rome, and of which here we have the beautiful representation. I mean, that's the same year of the French invasion. So if that was began to build with those principles at that time, evidently those principles were already known, had been already formulated, and it's not a surprise that was happening in Italy even before the 30s. If you take the fortifications of Verona, built in 1527 by San Michele, and characterized by the typical angular bastions, you can see that the Traces Italienne had actually developed before the 30s and reached only a mature and a full development at that time, and then remaining essentially up to the time of Vauban the basic say school for military architecture, which tells you, by the way, how effective that was, because it took, in this sense, more than 1 century to be eventually surpassed by other schools. It was imitated with the Flemish school eventually, Also in there for certain reasons, because I mean Italy and Flanders turned out to be the battlefields of Europe, and incidentally were some of the most advanced areas, not only of Europe but of the whole world, and therefore the local the local communities were developing such new ideas because of the intellectual and material resources that they had. Then eventually it's with the France of Louis XIV that there is a new model. I mean, the Renaissance basically ends. It ends it begins the real age of the modern state, for which it's not a bunch of lords who decide to fortify here and there, but it's a world state that uniformly conceives its territory as a great infrastructure that has to be defended with an homogeneous and structural set of fortifications in strategically relevant locations and all. But even Vauban, in this sense, had proceeded on the shoulders of those who had come before, just like the Italians had come from the had worked from the shoulders of medieval fortifications that something had managed to achieve up to that point. So the fascination for, however, for the ancient models, the typical of the Renaissance, remained out there. So that the same Albrecht Dürer, who was one of the greatest. If you don't know, I hope you you all know who Albrecht Dürer really was. You look at all the engravings that he has done. He is another one about fortifications. He lived between, also in here, between the end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century. Was a picture, engraver, mathematician, and treatiser. He was German. He was from Nuremberg. That was, by the way, one of the most advanced. He's considered the greatest. First of all, the greatest. He was son of a Hungarian, telling the truth. He was the maximum exponent of the Renaissance German painting. He went to Venice, where he entered into Neoplatonic circles. He had this esoteric interests. He also had he was fully drinking, let's say, from the spring of this new Renaissance theories in most advanced, in fact, lands of Europe. But even him, as a good full Renaissance man, in spite of all the evident transformations of the world, even from those classical models, he, while writing on fortifications, couldn't avoid to dedicate a very wide space to their fortifications, to their systems. Even though the firearms had basically were going the other way, because those models were functioning for the classical era, not for the Renaissance anymore, with firearms and all. So let's give a look to what really the Trace Italienne was really about. What was the or better, we're not discussing about that proper, but we let's see what the concepts were practical about. So as we were saying before, with the by listing the various people who mostly contributed to the to the development of the modern, say, of the class Italienne at the beginning, we can spot, first of all, Francesco di Giorgio Martini, we already talked about. That was more of a treatise than an actual... I mean, we don't really know much about him, as far as I know, in the sense that we have an extensive treatistic production. But we don't fully understand how much his... what his knowledge was really about, because in this treatises it was plenty of machinery, of fortifications, of drawings, essentially. Much of the Renaissance was based on this. All the greatest scientists of that time were treatises on in their kind, but they there was a sort of we have the historical problem of determining how much he actually built, because the books survive, but what about what he was responsible for in terms of actual military architecture? We don't know. These were sometimes in part were theorizations, of course, but there was surely some practical transformation. It is also important to notice that Francesco di Giorgio Martini was he theorized certain models that eventually the same class Italienne would have surpassed. So not everything he wrote about was effective in in what basically done. He's usually thought as the theoretician, while the Sangallo brothers were instead the ones who, around the 80s of the 15th century, as we've seen, began to theorize something different. That is essentially the pentagonal bastion. So the bastion fort, the Italian bastion fort, is therefore a Sangallo invention. Antonio and Giuliano da Sangallo were the two architects. And what is amazing about these brothers is that they managed to build up an impressive amount of fortresses based on their projects. So here we have the direct evidence between their theorization and the practical achievement that were extremely incredibly homogeneous and coherent in the way they were built. And the intelligence and the coherence were definitely behind the new concept that the classe Italienne was implying. Practically, now there are many difficult terms that probably I will tell you. You will say, well, what does this practically mean? Well, let's try to make it simpler. The idea is that the main problem or theory, as we have seen, is that the castle, as it was known before, as developed in height, so not being there before, no other means basically to destroy its walls, if not rebuilding them, because medieval siege warfare had been very dynamic in this sense. You can't even make a wall crumble, but the idea is that siege warfare, siege equipment was so slow and relatively weak that basically the besieged garrison could rebuild from the interior the same wall that had been taken down before it could be taken down. Forgive me for the word game, but that was really the concept. So obviously they couldn't rebuild the wall during the siege as if nothing happened, but with cheaper material they could, however, re-wall that or create a sort of barricade that was still a pretty difficult thing to get to surpass for the besiegers. So the real problem in practice was to, at this point with artillery, that this height of the fortifications was practically of no use anymore. And the the first thing you would really do was to try, first of all, to lower the fortification. But not just only that, but substantially raise the ground in front of the fortification with a sort of ditch in the middle, so that artillery couldn't fire directly at the walls. The walls, by the way, at this time were starting to be built into muttons that were cheaper. They were easier to use compared to stone, and especially they were more elastic compared to artillery. So the Sangallo brothers especially had they were still using stones basically to just to decorate and to strengthen the let's say the long mutton courtains, but it's very important with this sheer mass loaded with cinetic energy that impacts against the walls, that you have something that can absorb a material that can absorb all that force without being transferred more, being dispersed more on the surface, and then just being absorbed by a narrower surface, like it happened with stone. So the Sangallo brothers began to in this sense to make the bastions, even the bastions, not just the towers, to be shorter, and they began to make these corners, essentially these angled corners that could, in this sense, be by making the walls not impacted at 90 degrees and trying to, in this sense, render to diminish the amount of force that arrived against the walls by essentially deflecting the vector, so that it wouldn't hit at full force, but just only a fraction of that. And certain batteries, this is also important, were put in the angles of the narrowing of the narrowings between the bastions and the curtain, so that the blind spots could be rendered could be in this sense be eliminated, because that was a concern of medieval siege warfare, that as long as you had a sort of completely squared castle with no protrusions, let's say, from the outside, there were unavoidably certain blind spots around the perimeter that were used by the besiegers to eventually, I don't know, put ladders and climb up. So obviously, even during the Middle Ages, there had been an evolution of this kind to build more exposed, to pretend towers from the outside, so that it could cover with their angle even part of a greater part of the perimeter, and shoot with everything they had, destroying things that those people were there behind. In the Traces Italiennes, what you have is essentially that it's let the enemy come, and let's shoot him down while he approaches from all sides. There were all these, let's say, even small, even outside the walls in the Traces Italiennes, there is these all these little smaller fortresses that allowed to make it were pretty small, but allowed to make this to concentrate fire on a single point from many directions, so that the advancing besieger would even be taken from the behind, from enemy fire, and being attacked from literally everywhere. This is a form of defense in depth. Let's say it was used, I don't know, even in World War the First. You don't create just a single line that can be broken, a single trench that can be passed and pierced, and then you don't. It's weak once that it's surpassed and can be attacked from sides and behind. You have all foxholes practically from which you can shoot, and everybody that enters in there has foxholes all around and gets shot down. But perhaps the major characteristics of these fortifications is, as I was saying, an artificial slope that was created in front of the ditch, that basically even prevented the artillery to fire straight at the fortification. Basically, imagine that you approach the fortification frontally and you have this slope that comes up, and you can't practically almost neither see the fortress that is behind that. When you get up there at the edge of the slope, so at the highest point, then you have a ditch down, so that the artificial slope creates this even a greater difference in height compared to the one that is just one of the ditch being dug underground. And once you get in front of that, on that edge, you're immediately exposed to the fire that comes from the enemy ramparts. So even if you want to bring artillery there to fire at the enemy at a closer range, you're basically exposing your artillery to a very close fire, and that is a hell of a problem. And even if you want to pass with men, you have essentially a very large ditch and often a smaller fortification before the bigger towers and ramparts. This is something actually was done even in the ancient world, in the medieval world. You don't have to think it was something so unnew, but this became systemic, especially the idea of the artificial slope and the angular corners. Really added, and the shorter walls added a lot of effectiveness to this, and the artificial slope in this sense was thought partly to compensate the fact that the walls were shorter, because it was a sort of coming together of the two things. The artificial slope climbs and goes up, and the towers and the ramparts go down. So you create this situation for which you can't even shoot if not with a sort of more accentuated parabolical fire, that however partly decreases definitely the energy of the projectile once it arrives to the enemy walls. And creates all complications that really bring even siege warfare to respond in a certain fashion. Because the firearms in this sense didn't just trigger fortification as development, but it brought in this sense all other consequences in the relatively to the camp field fortifications, in logistics, in an increase in a more development, a greater refinement in artillery technology in itself. So all this was really based on geometry. There is another very important side of this, that is, in order to cope with these problems, a lot more of mathematical and geometrical knowledge were required. And you can argue that the Renaissance is really about all this. The treatises start to be written because it was these problems posed these new fortifications posed new problems that had to be solved through a mathematical systematization. It wasn't just anymore in the Middle Ages where you had a situation that was that had a very few answers you could give to, and it substantially was based on the sheer force of of the siege machinery, and there were very few responses to that were based on this hiring of the walls and relying on other strategic factors such as supplies and all. And this really during the Renaissance there is the problem to find a solution that is based on actual calculations. That is something that you have to refine. I mean, also medieval siege warfare was conceived about this. Mathematics was very important. It's no surprise that, I don't know, you find Trebuchet in 12th century Italy, and 12th century Italy is developing mathematics as well. Because that is pretty much obvious. But at this time, in the Renaissance, there are much more forces involved. There are much, therefore, there is a much faster rhythm of competition that you have to get up to, and this has to be resolved not just by practical attempts that were still the majority, obviously, as always, but there was a great interest to put into practice the mathematical knowledge. Put mathematical knowledge at the service of this new military needs. And that worked pretty well. I mean, as we've said, the Renaissance has this epiphenomenal production of treatises that most of the times are really something theoretical. These people were obsessed by the idea that there was a sort of fixed perfection that once you reached, it was done. Mathematics is in this sense perfection because it's a sort of it's a pure science. It's based on numbers that in this sense are very very ideally conceived. I mean, in real life you can apply mathematics to reality, but still the attrition for a myriad of factors can come in, and you realize that the history of warfare, yeah, it has greatly been influenced by science, but the greater advancements have been done, even thanks to true mathematics, only however from when problems arose from that theoretical background that you thought you had sort of drawn all you had to know, and then when you go into battle you realize that there are so many other factors that you have to take into consideration. This definitely triggered the advancement in mathematical studies. Also, in fact, with the need of with the aim of eventually finding a sort of a universal law for which you could make things work well. Unfortunately, this is not how reality works. I mean, reality works in this way, but in a level that for our poor cognitive means we can't catch up substantially. And even von Clausewitz in here, it's very interesting. Still in the 19th century with Antoine-Henri de Jomini. Jomini was relying in his Précis de l'art de la guerre on the so-called geometric, the internal lines. They were all geometrical assumptions for which he didn't claim, obviously, that war could be won just through that, but that if you had that manual in the pocket as a general on the battlefield, you could essentially solve these military problems to these calculations. Von Clausewitz had a much more concrete, and he was in fact a military genius, and even Jomini eventually ended up to recognize his genius, because also Jomini was a very intelligent person, by the way. Because warfare is something you can better with I mean, the art of war is something you can mm, better only with carry out only better with practice, with experience, and with things that have a very few to do with theorizations that in the reality of warfare actually can disappear, because mathematics definitely helps from a material point of view. I mean, artillery is based on mathematics. If you want to understand how artillery works, you cannot avoid to know mathematics. But still, knowing how to put artillery into use, that is not calculating, approximately how longer it's you can shoot, how long you can shoot, or at that difference in height where the bullet is gonna hit. Because into warfare there are lots of other factors, including the enemy shooting at you, that you have to take into consideration in order to put to good use that artillery. So Renaissance warfare is amazing in this sense, because it's a moment into which the Europeans began to formulate this idea that war could be theorized. War could be, studied as a sort of, just like other things, like history, for instance, as a sort of branch on its own. And there is this interest for fixing those theories, for really making them first of all accessible. Even the accessibility is very important of this knowledge, because the treatises were meant to be studied by generals to accomplish. This is some, geometrical principles are something that you find even pretty much in infantry tactics at this point. I mean, think about the canonic square block of pikemen of Renaissance warfare, all the maneuvers that this implied. I mean, at this time, Renaissance warfare, during Middle Ages, these formations had never had that kind of collective training that, especially the infantry, because cavalry really had, but cavalry was relatively few in number. But think about a square block of, 4,000 Swiss pikemen that you have to make march. I mean, you evidently require mathematics to make that work, and to have certain principles in maneuvering, in changing front, in passing from column formation to line formation for combat and all. So it's really civilization that slowly adds up, that goes on. And this is more or less what I wanted to tell you today. I don't know how good that was, because I'm not a good I can't explain properly all the times. But these were chiefly the concepts. So for now, I think it's enough for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested about my upcoming videos. And for now, thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.